This short instructional video will cover modern language association style guides for in-text citations with a focus on writing about literature. If you watched the first video, you know that we begin with the works cited page. The whole point of modern language association style is to direct your reader to your works cited page. It lists all the sources of the information that you've cited in your essay. So let's look at one of these sources that are listed here. Let's look at the short story by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. So the first word that appears in this entry is her last name, Gilman. That's important because remember, we're going to point the reader back to this source. And the way we do that is by looking at the first word that appears in this entry. And here the first word is Gilman. So in our essay, when we quote from the short story, and here's an example, the narrator asserts, "But I must say what I feel and think in some way, it is such a relief." Okay, I have quoted this from the short story, and the first word that appears in the parenthetical citation is the last name of the author, and that's because it's the first word that appears in the works cited list entry. You'll also notice that in the works cited list entry, we have the full page range with the abbreviation PP in front of it. So the short story begins on page 346. It concludes on page 357. We have the entire range of pages where we will find that short story on our works cited page. But that's not the case here. In our in-text citation, we're going to list only the page where the quote comes from. And notice that unlike the works cited list, which has the PP abbreviation in front of the pages, we have no such abbreviation here. There's no comma between the name of the author and the page, and there's no PG or no word page in front of the actual page number. So there's simply a space. Okay, another way of doing this is to put the attribution in the introductory phrase. So we have Gilman, that first word, in this case again it's the last name of the author, in the introductory phrase, and then the only thing that appears in the parenthetical citation is the page number. Let's look at another example here. Let's pick on Alexander Pope here. His epic poem, Rape of the Lock. Okay, so again, the first word that appears is his last name, Pope. And so what we're going to have in our parenthetical citation is that first word. And so Pope points us to that entry. Again, see, the whole point is to point your reader back to this works cited page. This is why we begin with our works cited page, because then when we're writing our essay, we just keep pointing the reader back to this page that we've already created. We look at whatever that first word is, and again, in the case of Alexander Pope, the first word that appears in this entry is Pope, and that's the word we're going to use to point the reader back to that entry. Unlike works of prose, we are going to include the word line for the line number that we are quoting from in this poem when we quote from the poem the first time. So the first time you quote from a poem, include the word line or lines if you have more than one line that you're quoting from that poem. Because unlike works of prose, we don't indicate the page number, we indicate the line number. So this particular quote comes from line 2. And the first time, obviously this is the first time that we're quoting from this poem in our essay, so we use the word line to indicate that this is a poem and that we're quoting lines here, not page numbers. Thereafter, when you quote from the poem, you can simply put in the number and your reader will understand that it is a line number, not a page number. Okay, we can do it this way as well. We can introduce the quote by attributing it to Pope at the very beginning. The whole point is whether it appears in our introductory phrase or in our parenthetical citation, we have to include the first word of that works cited list entry. Again, in this case, the first word happens to be the last name of the author. So we have Pope begins his mock epic poem, and of course, Pope is the first word. And in my introductory phrase, I've got that first word, so I don't need to include it in my parenthetical citation. In my parenthetical citation, I can just have the line number. All right, let's look at this entry. National Endowment for the Arts is an organization. When we have corporate or organization authors, this gets a little different. Here we have a quote from this particular source, and notice that we don't have to use the entire name in the parenthetical citation. That'd be very cumbersome to put National Endowment for the Arts within the parenthetical citation. So I can just include the first word or maybe two words of that organization, enough to point my reader to that source. I can also abbreviate. When I'm shortening the title, I can abbreviate words such as national or such as department, and that is acceptable in MLA format. So that's going to point my reader back to the word national, and then I've got National Endowment, so it's very clear, and I see that that's the source. Again, this is why we use hanging indents in our works cited page, to make it easy for the reader to just simply go down that list and look for that first word that appears on that list, and see if you can match it to what you put in your parenthetical citation. Okay, let's look at Shakespeare here. So Shakespeare, in this entry, we've got two works by William Shakespeare. One is The Merchant of Venice, which I've pointed to here. Another below it is Much Ado About Nothing. So I'm going to have to be really specific here. I can't just use Shakespeare. I've got to let the reader know which of his works I'm quoting from. Again, the first word is Shakespeare. Whether I'm quoting from Much Ado About Nothing or Merchant of Venice, I'm going to use Shakespeare as that word. That's the last name of the author. It's also the first word that appears in that entry. I can do it this way. As Portia declares in Shakespeare, so I've got the word Shakespeare there in my introductory phrase, the Merchant of Venice, and again I've got the Merchant of Venice in my introductory phrase, and then I've got the quote, "The quality of mercy is not strained." Notice that with verse plays, and we'll talk more about this later in the video, we have a different set of numbers here, right? It's not indicating a page number, but what we have is the first number 4 indicates the act, the second number 1 indicates the scene, and then the third number, 182, indicates the line number from that play. This is a verse play, and so we use these numbers to indicate the act, scene, and line number. We separate those numbers by periods, and we use Arabic numerals, not Roman numerals, right? So this is one way to point to this particular source. I've used the last name of the author to point to that first word that appears in the entry. And I've also indicated the play because I have more than one play listed here. Another way I could have introduced this is I could have just simply said Portia declares, right? Now, if I do this, I need to indicate all of these elements. I've got to indicate Shakespeare, the first name that appears, which is the last name of the author in my works cited entry. I also have to indicate in an abbreviated form the play, right? Because I didn't do that in my introductory phrase. And perhaps it's not clear from the context of my paragraph which play I'm quoting from. I have to be very clear about which play I am citing. So I use the word merchant to distinguish it from Much Ado About Nothing. If I were quoting from Much Ado About Nothing, I wouldn't write Much Ado About Nothing. I'd write perhaps much or much ado, right? Note also that because I have italicized the words The Merchant of Venice in my works cited page, I'm going to italicize them in my parenthetical citation. If it's italicized in your works cited page, it has to be italicized in your parenthetical citation. Let's look at one more example here. This is, of course, from an episode from Friends. The first word is the. We don't pay attention to the words the, a, or an when we're alphabetizing, and so we're going to need more than that when we refer to the actual source. But here's the quote. At the height of mutual deceit and intrigue, Phoebe declares, "They don't know that we know they know we know." And I'm taking that from this episode. So I've got the one, and notice that I didn't quote the entire title. I didn't put the one where everybody finds out. That would be far too lengthy and cumbersome. But I'm just using the words the one. That's enough to point my reader to the word one, which is alphabetized under one, not under the word the. Also notice that the location is a little different here because this is, of course, a video, not a print source, not a digital reading source. And so the location here is the timestamp. And so we know that this quote comes from 13 minutes and 18 seconds into the episode until 13 minutes 20 seconds into the episode. And notice that because we have put quotation marks around the title of the episode, the one where everybody finds out, we're going to put quotation marks around the phrase the one. Remember, if it's between quotation marks in your works cited page, it's got to be between quotation marks in your parenthetical citation. Whatever formatting you use in your works cited page, you've got to duplicate that formatting in your parenthetical citation. Okay, one more source here, the Bible. The Bible, of course, is alphabetized under B. We don't pay attention to the words the, a, or an. And so we're going to introduce the quote like this in the Bible, and then we have the quote. Notice, though, unlike any other source, we're not going to be pointing the reader to just the Bible. We've got to include the book, chapter, and verses. We abbreviate the book, so we have GEN for the book of Genesis. MLA format actually lists all the books of the Bible and their abbreviations. So you're going to use a 3-letter abbreviation for the book of the Bible, regardless of which book you select. And then you're going to have a period, and then the Arabic numeral for the chapter, followed by a colon, and then followed by the numerals for the verse or verses that you are quoting. And so notice that I'm pointing to the Bible with the word Bible, but I also include the chapter and verses of the particular book in the Bible. All right, if it is a short quote, and what do we mean by a short quote? A short quote is 4 lines or fewer within your own paragraph. Then you integrate it within your own paragraph, as we see here. Rodriguez says, we remained a loving family, and it goes for no more than 3 lines within my own paragraph. And as long as I've got 4 lines or fewer within my paragraph, I'm good. We integrate it into my paragraph just like this. We put quotation marks around it, and notice that the period falls after the parenthetical citation. But if I have a long quote, and let's say we've got more than 4 lines, and as we can see here, we definitely have more than 4 lines. Notice that even if it's a partial line, like the word sounds is just on its own line here, we count that as a line. So I have 6 lines here, even though the word sounds is a partial line. In fact, line 1, we remained a loving family, is a partial line as well, but we count that as a full line. So now we've got 6 lines. This is certainly more than 4 lines. We are not allowed to integrate it into a paragraph like this with quotation marks. We have to use what is called block format. Now, block format is, as you can see, you increase indent only a 1/4 inch, or you tab in once to begin your paragraph. You're going to increase indent twice, or 1/2 inch from your margin for a block quote. And you're going to do that only from the left margin. You do not increase indent from the right side, only from the left side. And notice that we have removed the quotation marks. There are no quotation marks around this quote. By using block format, we are indicating this is a quote. These are the exact words that are being said. We don't need quotation marks. That would be redundant at this point. By using block format, we are indicating this is a quote. We've also placed the final period before the parenthetical citation, which is different from short quotes. And so the period actually moves to before the parenthetical citation when we have a long quote like this. All right, when including a quote within a quote, you need to change those to single quotation marks. Let me give you an example here. So let's say we want to use this excerpt from Mark Twain's Reading the River. But what does the lovely flush in a beauty's cheek mean to a doctor but a break that ripples above some deadly disease? I want to use that whole bit there, including the word break that has quotation marks around it. So in my essay, I would write, Twain asks, quote, what does the lovely flush in a beauty's cheek mean to a doctor but a, and notice that now, as I have double quotes around the word break in the original, I'm changing them to single quotes here because I cannot have double quotes inside double quotes. Let's look at another example here. Here's the original. When chemotherapy fails to cure Mrs. Bacon's cancer, what we say is Mrs. Bacon failed chemotherapy, and I want to use that from this essay. And I say, according to Perry Class, when chemotherapy fails to cure it, and I've got the whole quote here, right? Well, in the original, of course, that's where the quotation marks appear. And because I've got quotation marks inside quotation marks, I've got to change them to single quotes. And I know that looks a little goofy there before the parenthetical citation to have a single quote followed immediately by a double quote, but that's exactly how you do it. Okay, when quoting someone who was quoted by your source, you need to use the abbreviation QTD in. So let's look at this example. Carl Jung makes a similar observation of mob mentality, and then we have this quote that comes from Carl Jung. The thing is, we didn't read anything actually written by Carl Jung. We found this quote in a source by Amy Griffin. Amy Griffin wrote an article called Jackson's the Lottery, and she's talking about mob mentality, and we like this. She quotes Carl Jung. We like this quote by Carl Jung. So in our parenthetical citation, we need to make it very clear that we didn't read something written by Carl Jung. We found this in this source by Griffin. So we have QTD, period. That's an abbreviation for quoted. The word in, and then the name Griffin, because that's where we found it, is in her source. And again, we're pointing the reader to our works cited list entry that begins with her last name, Griffin. All right, let's look at different works of literature and how to cite them. We'll begin with novels. As with all prose, when your citation is more than 4 lines on your page, you use block indentation. You want to give the page number followed by a semicolon and the chapter, and then a volume number if there is one indicated. So let's look at some examples of how to do this. This comes from Jane Eyre, and we have this really long quote from Jane Eyre. And just as before we indent, of course, once to begin a paragraph, we increase indent twice the entire quote from the left margin. And we have in the parenthetical citation the page number 141, followed by a semicolon, followed by an abbreviation CH, which of course stands for chapter, and then the chapter number 12. So this appeared on page 141 in chapter 12 of the novel. If it includes a volume number, we've got to include that as well. So here's another quote, this one from Austen's Mansfield Park. Here we have 533, which of course is the page number, followed by a semicolon. Now this time the abbreviation VOL, period, which stands for volume, because this particular novel is a part of a 3-volume set. And so we have 3, this is the 3rd volume, comma, and then chapter 17, again using the abbreviation CH. So this is how you would cite a novel. Typically you don't have volumes, so you don't have to worry about that, but you are going to need that page number, semicolon, and at least a CH period for the chapter, and then give the chapter number. All right, let's move on to poetry. When citing 3 lines or fewer of poetry, you include the quote within your own text. You use quotation marks, of course, around the whole thing, and slashes to indicate where the line breaks appear in the poem. The parenthetical citation includes line numbers, not page numbers. We talked a little bit about this earlier. And if citing a poem that has only lines and no cantos, books, or other parts, then you want to use the word line or lines in your first citation. And then having established that the numbers designate lines, and then you just give the number or numbers alone thereafter. So let's look at an example here. This is from Whitman's poem, When I Heard the Learned Astronomer. And we have here the slash that indicates the line break. So how soon unaccountable I became tired and sick, space, slash, space, till rising, right? So that indicates that that's where one line ended, and here's where another line is going to begin. And then in my parenthetical citation, I use the word lines because this is the first time that I'm quoting from a poem. And so I indicate that I'm giving you lines, not pages, and then 5 through 6, lines 5 through 6. Then the next time I quote from this poem here, I'm going to just include the line number. I don't have to use the word line or lines. Okay, let's look at what we do if we have more than 3 lines. We use block format. And we place the lines in the same relative positions as they appeared in the original poem. If a line of a poem doesn't fit within the margins of your essay because you're using this block format, then it needs to be formatted with hanging indentation. So let's look at an example from, again, Walt Whitman, because he writes these incredibly long lines. And we can see here that the first line that we quote in this block format is in hanging indent. That's because it is such a long line, it won't fit. I increase indent twice from the left margin, as I'm supposed to for block quotes. I've got more than 3 lines of a poem here. But because it's so long, it continues back. And I need to make it clear to the reader that this is actually supposed to all show up on one line. So I use this hanging indent here. And then I have lines 5, 6, 7, and 8 that follow. And in my parenthetical, I'm using 4 through 8 to indicate that this comes from lines 4 through 8. Assuming I've already introduced this as a poem, I've already used the word line or lines in a previous citation, I only need to put the numbers now. And so the numbers represent the line numbers. And again, 8 down here, this is the particular line where this quote comes from. Okay, let's look at how to use block format with a poem that has these interesting indentations. This comes from Gerard Manley Hopkins. Remember, we have to format it as closely as possible to the original. So in the original, we have these kind of interesting indentations. I'm going to indent each line at least twice from the left side. Notice that I tabbed in once to begin my paragraph. I'm going to tab in twice for each of these lines. But some of these lines I'm going to space in even more, right? I'm going to increase the indentation even more because I need to imitate his indentation in his original poem. The line spacing is part of the poetic message, and so I need to represent that as best I can in my long quote. Again, 1 through 4 indicating the lines that I'm taking this poem from, not the page numbers. And again, down here, the same thing, 7 indicating the line number. All right, when citing poetry that is divided into parts, then you do need to include in the parenthetical citation the part, the book, or the canto, followed by a period and then the line numbers. So let's look at a couple of examples here. This comes from Tennyson's The Lady of Shalott, and we have 2 period 6 through 9. Well, the period is to separate the part 2, and then 6 through 9 represents the line numbers where this is taken. Also notice that I have indented the last line even more here because it is indented even more in the original. Again, I'm going to preserve the formatting as best as I can. All right, in Milton's Paradise Lost, again, I've got a 1 followed by a period and then some other numbers. This indicates that this comes from Book 1 of Paradise Lost and lines 105 through 108. Okay, when citing verse plays, such as Shakespeare's plays, we're going to treat them just like poetry. 3 lines or fewer of a verse play when it's spoken by a single character, we're going to include that in quotation marks within our own paragraph. We're going to integrate it into our own text here, and we're going to use quotation marks and slashes to indicate the line breaks, just as we would with poetry. When we're quoting dialogue between 2 or more characters, then we're going to need to set that off in block format, and we're going to have to begin each part of the dialogue with the character's name, all in capital letters. And then lastly, the parenthetical citation does include the act, scene, and line number, as we saw in an earlier slide. So we don't reference page numbers at all with verse plays. So let's look at a few examples by Shakespeare. Here we have a quote from Macbeth, and we have "Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player, space, slash." This is where the line break appears in the original. Shakespeare is writing typically in blank verse, which means that after every 10 syllables, he's making a line break, right? So we've got "Life's but a walking shadow," line break. "That struts and frets his hour upon the stage," another line break. And notice we put spaces on both sides of the slash. And then in the parenthetical citation, we have in Arabic numerals the act, period, scene, period, and line numbers. Act 5, scene 5, lines 24 through 26. And then from another play, As You Like It, "All the world's a stage," slash, this is where that line ends, and the next line begins, "and all the men and women merely players." And here again we have act, period, scene, period, line numbers. Act 2, scene 7, lines 139 through 140. Again, all in Arabic numerals. If we have more than 3 lines, then we're going to need to use this block format. And notice that we're breaking the lines exactly where they're broken in the original. "Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player." No slash. We don't need any slashes now because we're using block format. We're just going to mimic it as best we can, just like we would with a regular poem, right? We would imitate the structure, the formatting as best we can. And so we're going to just break the lines exactly where they're broken in the original. And then at the bottom here, again, we have the act, scene, and line numbers indicated in Arabic numerals separated by periods. Now, if we have dialogue, we're going to remember we're going to have to use these names to indicate who's speaking. So we have Queen all in caps, Hamlet all in caps, and we've got this dialogue between the two. I want to point something out here at the very end of this quote. We have, as kill a king, spoken by the queen. And then Hamlet picks up the rest of that line with, I, lady, it was my word. So there's a space between the word Hamlet and his line, I, lady, it was my word. That's because in the original that space appears, and this is to indicate that this is all one line. As kill a king, I, lady, it was my word. That's all one line. Shakespeare sometimes does this. He has a character begin a line and then another character finish the line, and this is exactly what he's done here. So when you see the parenthetical citation, Act 3, Scene 4, lines 28 through 31, line 31 actually is, as kill a king, I, lady, it was my word. That's all line 31 is. Again, we've got the reference here in the parenthetical citation, and again later when we quote from the play again. So we have act, scene, and line number indicated. All right, prose plays are a little different. Prose plays, we treat prose plays just like we would treat any other prose. We treat verse plays just like we would treat any other poetry, right? So we're going to use page numbers with prose plays because that's what we use with prose. We're going to follow that page number with a semicolon and then the act. And if there's a scene, we're going to include that as well. For all plays, obviously stage directions should be treated like any other quoted text. They can be replaced with ellipses, those little dots, if you want to use them to omit that stage direction, but you can't just leave the stage directions out without indicating to your reader that you've taken them out. All right, so let's look at some examples here. In Henrik Ibsen's A Doll's House, we've got this quote. We're using block format, and just like with any other prose, we take out the quotation marks, we move the period, of course, before the parenthetical citation, and here we have the page number, 1329, followed by a semicolon, and then the word act, and then 3. If we had a scene, we'd put comma, scene, and then indicate the scene number. And that concludes our introduction to in-text citations when writing about literature. I hope this video has been helpful, and good luck.